So, Bill, how's everything going?
Everything's good, Sensei. How are you today?
I'm doing okay. We had a pretty big class.
How many do we have for class today?
18.
18.
18 on a Sunday.
So, in the middle, the pandemic still going on. We have California and LA regulations, masked up, vaccine cards.
Masked up, vaccine cards.
And we've got 18 people on a Sunday, which
Yep.
is pretty close to what is maybe our normal high.
Yeah, 18 is a very good number.
Yeah, it is.
Maybe not for other schools, but for 18,
it's a
this is
good
a very
number.
good number.
Especially on a Sunday,
Yeah.
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 a week before Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
That's right. We are 1 week from Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Is everyone in town for Thanksgiving?
We are live in town.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, we're here for Thanksgiving. We're not going away.
Mother-in-law's right down the street.
So
not
we're all
going-
here.
We
Yeah.
luckily don't have to travel. Some people are like, think Andrew has to go to Seattle.
Yeah, I think traveling for Thanksgiving this year is going to be rough.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Mm-mm.
No.
Don't want it.
So for today, I think we have, again, this is our third or fourth week with a listener
Something like
question.
that.
We've had a lot of listener questions.
Yep.
That's
and
good.
So today's question, it comes from Ayudi, and she wanted to know, how do you reconcile the aggressiveness of irimi with the philosophy of peace in Aikido?
Yeah.
Well, I think not just Riminage, but any art, especially in Aikido, can be dialed up and dialed down. And isn't that the beauty of Aikido? The fact that you can dial it up and dial it down? Or is it, we're talking more specifically about the aggressiveness?
Well, I know with Ayudi that she and I talked about this a little bit. She was literally talking about trying to see if we could give her some practical advice on the psychology of the technique. Because when we were practicing, we were doing Tenkan and Riminage, and she was saying that for her, that last part where you come up and you cross through the person, that she was just literally finding that she called it somatic. She said her body didn't want to go through the other person's space.
Philosophy.
Yeah, well, she was asking about practical psychological advice about being able to do irimi while still holding this art of peace philosophy.
Well, that's where you have to kind of go back to the beginning, right? Back to the beginnings of Aikido. Aikido is based on swordsmanship. So if you look at things like Yagyu Shinkage, like if you look at basic Itoryu swordsmanship, the feet are both facing forward.
Right.
The genius of Yagyu Shinkage is that the back foot turned inward, allowing you for lateral and parrying moves. And then the genius of O-Sensei is supposedly that he turns out the front foot. They call it some people call it the 60-60 stance. But I get what we're saying is that swordsmanship, it's designed to only move forward and cut. You know, like some people believe that parrying is cowardice, right? So there's this idea that you should be only moving forward. And so you do this irimi. So if you look at the different styles of Aikido, Yoshinkan, Tomiki, and all that stuff, you'd see different levels of irimi.
Right.
So if you look at Yoshinkan, which is pre-war Aikido, Shioda Sensei has a really strong irimi. And, and that's funny because if you look at that with O-Sensei, you don't see his irimi as much in the videos, but he has a very strong irimi as well. So when he defeated that kendo practitioner, he used irimi. He used irimi in a fan, bam, hit the guy on the head, defeated him. But he used irimi.
Right.
So the idea about irimi is that, technically speaking, some schools do not teach irimi. It's implied.
Interesting.
It's because that when you came to Aikido in the old days, you would already have studied a different martial art or swordsmanship. So you would already know how to move forward. And so they just taught Tenkan, Tenshin, and then a little bit of irimi. But the thing is that like irimi is this thing that it's supposed to be the gauge of your personal level. So if the person faces off with you and you can irimi into their attack without fear and all those different things,
right,
you will have arrived. But if you move forward and then you're afraid or, it really messes up you psychologically, then that shows your level. So that's why that's what irimi is supposed to be. But so the technique that you're talking about, like irimi nage from like Yakuhami or something like that, that's a little bit different because there's this whole idea about unearthing your opponent. So you move in, and you always try to create a cross with their hips.
Right.
So you attack. In the old days, you attacked their hips with your hips. In Shihonage, they used to use this like bumping method to bump their center so that they could move under. And then in the old days, you couldn't just throw somebody kokinage, iriminage over the top. It wouldn't work. In the old days, you had to give them a little bit of elbow music, maybe even a little bit of sternum hit, and then you throw them because the balance is already broken.
Right.
Right. And so that's this idea of like why irimi still exists. You have to have irimi because you have to. Without irimi, Aikido becomes this completely passive art. I'm grab my wrist. Oh, the other way. No, you got to grab my wrist. Right. But with irimi, you can initiate contact. You can initiate the attack. You can do all these things. So on a certain level, irimi is the great balancer of Aikido because a lot of the Aikido techniques become defensive or reactionary, but irimi is offensive, and it's I don't know what you call it. You move forward on the person.
So if you're an early student or a young student or even just any student, but let's say you're earlier in your training, your first few years of training, and the entering feels very difficult for you. Maybe you're saying for some people it's fear. For other people, maybe as Ayudi is saying, that she feels like this somatic awareness that it's hard to get into that space. Is the best way to handle that to just consistent training and basically just trying to do it over and over and over again until you don't feel that way anymore?
Well, yeah, over and over and over again, because again, it's a gauge of where you are psychologically. So if you're afraid, if you get angry, if you get frustrated, whatever it is, you go, oh, that's what the irimi brings out on you, because you're moving into your partner's space. You're moving into their attack. You're moving into their space. And when you move into their space, that causes you to feel all these things. So let's say you move in and you're afraid of this person, so you just don't like it.
Right.
Well, then why am I afraid of this person? Or let's say you move in and you just try to kill this person. Why am I trying to kill this person?
Right.
So any of the feelings that it brings up, you should try to examine. And so when you think about this idea of irimi and this idea of the art of peace, they don't really coincide so much.
Right.
But they don't coincide because irimi is about attacking, right? And the art of peace is not about attacking or something like that, or so people think. But the thing is that it's how you move in. It's the state of mind as you move in. Can you move in when that person strikes at you and irimi that person with nothing, no emotion?
See, I think part of what I took away from what Ayudi was saying is the paradox of all, I don't want to call it righteous violence, but all violence. Like if you take some people, I'm not naming names, but some people might look at the philosophy of Aikido and say that you can only be counterattack or counter response. You can never initiate. It's got to be essentially passivistic. And I mean, I wonder whether just extrapolating from what she's saying is how do you put all the sort of devastating attacks and techniques that are in the Aikido repertoire and combine that with this idea that you're not supposed to hurt your attacker. In fact, you shouldn't even be having this relationship with the attacker. With, let's say, scenarios where violence may be the only way to preserve yourself.
Violence isn't always the only way. I mean, it may seem like it, right? But subduing that person, even unless they're like on PCP or something. Do people still take PCP? That's a drug of the 70s.
I think it's ayahuasca now.
Yeah, so people don't, but if you took PCP and then you could break their arm and they wouldn't feel it, but generally you should be able to incapacitate them in some way. But the idea is it's not that you can't rough someone up with Aikido. You can, but that's not the point. The point is to kind of figure out for yourself how you can maintain this calmness. So you probably both have heard of this idea of like Katsujin-ken, Satsujin-ken, the sword that takes life, the sword that preserves life.
Sure, absolutely.
So if you read D.T. Suzuki's interpretation of that, it's that the sword kills all on its own. It might be in your hand, but it's not you that kills them. It's the sword that kills them.
because you don't have any judgment in your heart. Right. Or any hate in your heart.
No judgment, no hate. So many different ways you could look at it. You could look at it from an impermanent standpoint. You could look at it from a lack of emotion standpoint. You could look at it from this idea of being detached from it. But it's that the sword is an inanimate object, right? The sword comes up, the sword comes down. It kills, right, when that happens. But then you're not holding on to that killing, right? The person attacked you and you just parried and cut them down. But you're not thinking about it afterwards. Oh, this thing, why should I do these things? And then largely, sometimes people on a different level think about O-Sensei's philosophy of nonviolence as not being true, because some of it has been interpreted by other authors to become the art of peace. When O-Sensei, like sometimes I see these quotes on the internet, O-Sensei said, O-Sensei, and I'm like, I don't remember reading that anywhere. And then it becomes a soundbite. Like, when I do any writing, I always look up the quote first to make sure it's correct. I go, I want to use this quote. I'll look it up on the internet, and then if you go to like Wiki Quotes, it'll tell you where it came from. And then I'll go to our own library and go, oh, okay, yeah, that's right. Because I don't want to accidentally misquote O-Sensei. And so largely, we're all talking about this thing, the art of peace, the art of peace, the art of peace. Well, you can't be, you can't start some stuff with people and do the art of peace at the same time. You can't, right? The art of peace is this thing that's inside of you that when you attacked me, I downed you, but I downed you in a way which it didn't disturb me. And then I may or may not killed you.
Right.
Right. But then we think, oh no, it's just this art of peace where you're like, oh, I practice the art of peace. Don't hit me. No.
But it's the peace is within you, right? Is that what you're saying?
Some of that is, yeah. Largely it's all you, right?
It's not that the action is peaceful. It's that no matter what happens out in the outside world, I'm at peace with myself.
I'm at peace myself because this person is saying things to you, attacking you, being mean to you. Well, why are you upset about that? Well, that person says you're a tall banana, but I'm not even a banana. Well, why are you getting upset? Well, this person said things about me. No, what we hate in others is what we hate in ourselves. So that person is just a mirror manifestation of our own inner peace. So you go, oh, that person's trying to start something. That person's trying to. Well, isn't it me? Didn't I come in here? Didn't I bump the guy first? Didn't I? So largely it was you. Most times when you're not bothering others, no one's bothering you. But it's when you do something and they go, I'm the victim now, you're attacking me, and then you try to start a fight.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think in the United States, especially in California, we have a unique relationship as a state to Aikido, and especially Aikido in the 60s and 70s with a certain brand, with a certain interpretation of what the philosophy of Aikido meant. And I think that's where a lot of people get hung up is, I'm not adept enough to translate O-Sensei wrote from the original, but it seems to me that there was a movement in the United States about certain political things, about peace, and the Aikido philosophy, people found in it what they wanted to find in it, to coincide and bolster their own political practice.
So, and so are you saying from the 60s, the hippie era is like peace, love, and harmony?
No,
man?
I do. I actually, I mean, it's not to rip on them. I'm just saying, like, I think that Aikido was was there at the right time for certain people as a practice that allowed people to do martial arts and feel a certain way about it. But the inheritance that we have from that experience is now this what I think is coming out here, which is this false conflict, that the conflict isn't really there, but because of the way we as Californians and Westerners take our own idea of pacifism and violence versus nonviolence, and then layer that over O-Sensei's writings or other Aikido writings and come up with an interpretation, which is this idea that you have to be a complete pacifist, and then how are you going to learn martial arts techniques if you can't do an irimi at all, if you're never going to do irimi? And I know that there's some schools that don't do irimi nage as a technique anymore.
Yeah. And that's the hard part. Like there's a school of Aikido that took out Ikkyo and irimi nage at the same time. Two irimi style techniques, right?
Which are both quintessential.
Well, you would say it's quintessential, but that person, the teacher, obviously took it out for a reason because they don't believe in that. But that's the hard part. Like maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, John Stevens came to our dojo and then he watched the first class and he said, oh, you guys are so aggressive. And then everyone was like, why did you say that? And I know what he was talking about. It's because we did so much irimi movement. It was like, oh my gosh, you guys are so aggressive, right? But that's that thing. Like you think because I'm moving in and being aggressive, that is not Aikido.
Right.
Right. But that's the thing that you don't, it's not Aikido if it's not Aikido in your heart. So you have to think this, what does the art of peace mean? So if this person is stabbing my wife and kids, then I can only subdue this person. Well, yeah, you're going to try, but what happens if as you're doing kotegaeshi and you accidentally slit his throat? Which people used to do.
Right, it could happen.
Right? You poke him right in the eye and it stabs his brain and kills him. Right? That is the sword which cuts all on its own.
Right.
But if you're trying to cut that person's throat, if you're trying to stab them in the eye, that's the aggressiveness, right? But the aggressiveness violence is everywhere. Any form of resistance at all is violence. Any thought against another person is violence, right? So you have to ask yourself, what is real violence? What is true violence? What is aggressiveness? If you want to be aggressive with someone, that's where you have to really kind of figure out what the art of peace is. The art of peace, at the highest level, the art of peace has nothing to do with killing or not killing, right? As D.T. Suzuki says, it's the sword cuts all on its own, right? But it has to do with, as what Mike was alluding to, is like this, what's inside of you, the inner peace. Did you desire to kill that person? Then that's not peace. But if it happened, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not peace.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking when we were talking about a potential title for today's podcast, you were talking about the art of peace versus the art of war, and I'm thinking of sort of the very beginning of not Sun Tzu but Clausewitz' Art of War, who basically says that war is the extension of political means through violence. That might be one way to think about Aikido, which is Aikido rejects that attitude that you should resolve these types of issues through violence. But as you're saying, there's another level, which is that violence is not off the table, but you're not going into it thinking that violence is the only way to solve the problem. And I'm kind of going around in a circle here, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, what Ayudi is saying is like, it's hard for me as a beginner to reconcile me having to go through someone's body space because that feels too aggressive, because that violates what I think the art of peace means. And I think we've kind of broken down what that I think art of peace means. And I think that we've probably broken that down enough to say maybe what you think the art of peace is actually not what it is. And I think that when you compare it to, how Western Europeans look about the purpose of violence as just another way to solve their problems, that Aikido is a more sophisticated way of looking at it. It's not that it's just another way to solve a problem, but it goes to this level. There's a reason it's a martial art and not just a
conflict resolution or
philosophical.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about is trying to get to this place where you don't have a bad intent.
Well, you don't have a bad intent, but there's all these levels of violence. So if I take you down with Ikkyo, but don't kill you, the manner in which I'm taking you down in Ikkyo could still be considered violence.
Well, I would say no matter how we do it, there's still an element of violence to
there
it.
There is. And so but that's that thing. Like, oh, well, I live in a peaceful world of not doing anything like, and then you're like, right? But no, any form of resistance, So if I pull your arm, that's a form of violence, even though I'm trying not to hurt you. Right. Hurting you or not hurting you is not necessarily the peace or not peace, right? So, if you think about Clausewitz's definition, violence is a means to an end.
Right.
But how far, how deep, how much, how violent, how aggressive, how not aggressive. So that's why it comes down to what's in your heart. So if that person attacks you shomenuchi, and you move in to do ikkyo, right? You move in with the intent to destroy that person, hurt them, all these different things, that's violence, right? But if you move in just to move in, as D.T. Suzuki says, you move in all on your own without the feelings of desire to hurt that person or not. There's still that moving in, which is considered violent, but it's not as violent.
Yeah.
Because of the intentionality of it?
The intention and what's in your heart. Like someone the other day asked me, if someone came in the dojo and tried to fight you, what would you do? I said, I only do one technique, man. Ikkyo irimi. And the only reason why ikkyo irimi, because I want to know where I am. And if I move in, I'll know right then what my true level is. Right. But that's the hard part, right? And you go, well, then why don't you do MMA and then bust out your ikkyo there? Well, it's not the same thing. There are rules. You can't just subdue him. You got to make that person submit. You have to do all these things, right? So because there's rules, there's, you ever watch martial arts videos when they go real full tilt on each other? They're like reaching, they're hitting, they're doing like the most crappiest attacks.
Yeah.
It becomes kind of like this, right? That it's not even a true attack. So I'll tell you an interesting story about something like that. So long ago, Furuya Sensei used to work at Inside Kung Fu magazine. And he was a writer there, a book editor, and all these different things. And so he's walking by the area which they were shooting videos. And this famous Eskrima teacher was doing Eskrima versus
sword
or bokken. And so he kind of looked through, and then they all saw him looking, and they go, "What do you think?" And
I think I heard this story.
Furuya Sensei was like, "Oh, it looks fine." And then someone said something like, "What do you think you could do better?" And Furuya Sensei was like, "Oh no, I'm fine. No, I'm just looking at." And they said, pick up the bokken.
Oh no!
And then Furuya Sensei is like, I don't want to do this. And then everybody's kind of like cajoling him into it. Mm-hmm. So he takes off his suit jacket. He goes, "Do you mind if I warm up a little bit?" And the guy's like, "Go ahead," all arrogant. Sensei just picks up the bokken, does maybe 10 cuts, and then the guy goes, "It's cool. You don't have to do it." And Furuya Sensei, he's like, "It's all right. It won't work. You got it. I couldn't do it on you."
Yeah.
And then the whole room was like dead silent. And Sensei's like, "Okay." And then just like walked out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's that thing, like where Sensei's cut was so strong and fast, as opposed to the person who was cutting this guy on the video was so weak and slow. When they saw the real cut, the person was like, "No thanks.
I don't want any part of this.
I don't want any part." So how does this tie into the art of peace versus aggressiveness or anything like that? It's that what does it mean to be real? Right. So that's why I said that when that person asked me, "What technique would you do?" I said, "I'm just going to do ikkyo irimi," because I want to see what level I'm truly at on the inside.
Right.
Where you could just move in, take the person out, ikkyo, boom, like that. Or you move in aggressively, anger, heart rate raises, adrenaline's pumping. That's all those things are levels of violence. But can you move in with no change in your inner world? No raise of heart rate, no raise of adrenaline, and do all these things, and then put that person down like nothing.
And walk away like
nothing.
Yeah. Very hard for most people, I would imagine.
Right, because there's all these things that come into play.
Emotions,
fear.
I don't want to. Everybody's watching me. I don't want to look bad. I don't want to do these things, and so you do all these different things, right? So that's the hard part. If you think about this idea of, it's not that aggressiveness is bad. Somewhere along the line, aggressiveness got painted with this brush of being bad. And yes, and so you say, you don't need to be aggressive. You must be assertive. That type of thing. No, it's like aggressiveness is not bad. because you have to move in, right? But it's what's in your heart that causes it to be bad, causes it to be violent.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though, because I think people definitely, there is a prepackaged, preconceived notion of what peacefulness means about Aikido that people have before they come to study Aikido.
Yeah.
The world out there sends a message about what Aikido is about, just like it sends messages about mixed martial arts or what judo's about or jiu-jitsu. People all come in with a little prepackaged booklet of what we're about. And then they come in and they're like, well, this doesn't match my booklet. And then they get all frustrated, especially here, I think. In our dojo, I think that it often doesn't match the booklet.
So here's a question. If you study the art of peace, Aikido, can you own a gun?
Well,
you're talking the wrong guy.
2 out of 3 says yeah.
So if you ask me, I would say no.
Right.
Because for me, I have a problem with aggressiveness. I have a problem with anger. Right. And so I'm trying my best to not have anything around which inspires that.
Right.
Right. And on a certain level, guns inspire that.
Yeah.
So for the two of you, no. So you ask yourself, was Free Sensei a gun person?
Well, that's a good question.
Well, here's a story. So years ago, probably 25 years ago, we used to do all these demonstrations in Little Tokyo. And this Aikido, this martial arts teacher would used to come and sit in the front row with cut off gi bottoms, a t-shirt, and this huge straw hat. And then we'd be demonstrating the whole time. He'd be saying, it's fake, like screaming under his, it's fake, it's fake. And then they had to ask him to leave because he would be starting so much trouble. So one year, Free Sensei gets his phone call, probably like 5 o'clock or something like that. And the voice on the other end said, I heard you think you're good at, martial arts, and I challenge you to a duel. And then Sensei goes, okay. He goes, so I'm going to come by and I'm going to kill you. And Free Sensei said, okay. And then so Free Sensei's waiting downstairs with two things.
Go ahead.
Pistol and a sword.
A pistol and a sword.
Yeah.
And I was like, really, Sensei? And he said, Sensei was like waiting, sitting seiza at the prescribed hour, sword, and his 38.
Yeah. I know that story.
And then the person never showed up. And then the next day we had a demonstration, and this guy comes up to Sensei and then starts talking to Sensei, and Sensei goes, did you call me last night? And the guy goes, no. I was just joking when I called you, just as a joke. And Sensei's like, I was waiting for you. And they go, oh, no, I don't mean it like that. It was a joke. And and he was friends with that martial arts teacher that used to come and heckle our shows.
Yeah.
Right. But it was kind of funny. But so, Sensei being an Aikido teacher, a high-level Aikido teacher, an Aikido teacher who studied under Second Doshu, Koichi Tohei, Mitsunari Kanai, all these famous Aikido teachers, when he was going to duel, he had the short sword. He had a shorter sword, right? Because you go into battle, you train with a long, heavy sword, and you go into battle with a short, light sword. It's his sword, and it's 38.
Yeah. I remember that. I know that story.
I don't know if, here's an Aikido teacher waiting to get crazy, right? He had a gun, but that's this idea. What is aggressiveness?
I think it's a really good question. I don't think it's easy to answer. I think that we've gotten a long way towards answering it. I think for me, a lot of it has to do with the prepackaged commercialism about Aikido around the art of peace that's out there in the internet, ether, so that when new students start, like I'll give you an example. I have a really good friend from college. He's married. He works for a big, Fortune 500 company. And whenever I go to see him in Northern California, so I see him 3 or 4 times a year. And he has kids that are like middle school, maybe early high school. And every time I see him, he's like, his wife, not him. His wife says to me, every time I see you, I always so happy to talk about Aikido because they're very religious. They're Baha'is. And they say to me, Aikido is the only martial art, if we were to do a martial art, that we could do, because it's the art of peace. That's literally like a quote sentence. And they say it to me every time I see them. And part of it's probably trying to be polite, to find something to talk to me about, to be, nice. But it's interesting, given their intellectual and religious background, that they've learned enough about Aikido that in their world they identify us with a certain set of beliefs that may or may not be true.
Yeah, and that's the hard part. Like the other day, I was at a party and someone was telling some story and he was like, did something. And you know what, man? I Aikido'd him. And he kind of points at me, I Aikido'd him. And I was like, in my mind, I'm all, what the hell does that mean? What do you like?
Aikido
fall on their face? Like, but he was trying to imply that he used passiveness as a redirection method to gain what he wanted to do.
So that raises a super interesting question, and we haven't done a podcast on it, but I'm sure that Ayudi and other students, including myself and Mike, would love to get your interpretation of, what exactly does that the Aikido, the name of Aikido mean in this context?
Aikido?
Yeah.
Well, means two things coming together, meeting. So we call that, we reinterpret that as harmony.
Yeah, this is why I want to talk about it, because it seems to me this is exactly where the public's marketing of Aikido has a certain interpretation, and the name of Aikido gets talked about and bandied about without Aikidoists' permission.
Right, and that you think that in Aikido we use our opponent's force against them to come to a mutual resolution where no one gets hurt.
So that's a super interesting thing you say that, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think that goes right to Ayudi's question, because irimi feels very much like not using the opponent's force against them. It's the moment where you are able to find the spot where you can anticipate or counter the force, and it doesn't feel like blending. Because blending is an element of Aikido, which is a lot of martial arts don't have. But irimi, as you said, it's a sword technique, and it's very, very aggressive. But how does that jive with what? Because I think the name of Aikido gets riffed on by people who are not Aikidoists.
Right. So the character I is meet.
Yeah.
Right. So in order for two things to meet, in order to meet, two things must come together.
Yeah.
Ki, energy. Do means way, right? So the way of meeting energy, right? And all these different things. And so, but that's the hard part. Like, let's say we did irimi and we did Yakuhamni Tenkan Kokyuho, and we came over the top and we irimi'd in and we threw the person down.
Right.
Okay, but let's say throwing the person down is too aggressive. So instead, I go to throw them and then I hold them. Right? I think that's better, right? If the person became afraid at all, that's violence. Right? If the person is starting something with you in the bar, but they're still afraid of you, that's violence. So see how it's really hard to reconcile this idea of violence, aggressiveness. Is it aggressive or assertive? That's assertive is just a euphemism for the passive, nice way to say aggressive. No, I'm not aggressive. I'm just very assertive. Right? What's the difference between aggressive and assertive, right? You're still asking for whatever it is.
It's a one of degree, really, judgmental degree.
Exactly. For me, I felt like you were being very aggressive. Right. And then you're like, I was just being mildly assertive.
Right.
Right. So
yeah, for some people, it's just a matter of style. I was going to say, when you're a lawyer, you really see the number line of meek to like totalitarian. I mean, there's people that, and it's, we call it in the law the sharp elbowed. The really aggressive people are normally New York lawyers, and they're called sharp elbowed because no matter what it is they ask for, even if it's just what the time of day is, like, damn it, what time of the day is it? I'm going to kill you, and because they can't like de-escalate even the most simple personal exchanges. And maybe that brings up another question, which is there an emotional or residual effect on one's training or personality if you are too aggressive all the time?
Well, but that's the thing. Like if you ask like Joseph Campbell, He says anything anyone does can be deemed, horrible by another person, right? So again, it's this idea coming back to inside of you. If my boss tells me to do this thing and I don't want to do it, and I give in, that's being passive. If I do it but I'm upset, that's passive aggressive, right? So everything, it really comes back to what's inside of you. You just do it. No, you don't. It doesn't raise your blood pressure, your aggressive levels, your adrenaline, or anything like that, because you just do it. That's where our peace is coming from. And then so you ask yourself, well, why do I use this word peace all the time, right? So this idea that if no one is you're not beating anyone up when you're in a good place.
See, I think some of it comes from, and maybe you can correct me in this, but because I don't know if it's the right word in translation, but isn't O-Sensei attributed to saying things like Aikido is love and things like...
Well, yeah, but then you also have to, there's a few different things you have to really try to figure out. Like, O-Sensei spoke a very archaic form of Japanese, right? So when I was talking with this Aikido teacher from, I think, Hawaii, he was telling me the story that during World War II, he went to find his family's village in Japan. And he journeyed by jeep, found his family, and he could not understand anything that they said, and he spoke Japanese. Their dialect was
sounds like Italy.
too deep, and he was just like, and he was like, as if he didn't speak Japanese at all, right? And that there's that thing, right? Like the O-Sensei spoke this really archaic form of Japanese. So there's that. People like Chiba Sensei, who was his Uchideshi, said, I have no idea what he was saying half the time.
Yeah.
Right. And so then you have people who are non-native speakers of Japanese interpreting O-Sensei's writings and sayings. Right. So then they might be, you look it up in a dictionary, and a westernized dictionary, they just came up with the best word for that. You could call it harmony.
Yeah.
Right. So then that's the really hard part when we say Aikido is love, Aikido is this thing. What I was saying before is that you can't, if you're in a good place, you're not out fighting people.
Right.
If you're in a good place, you're not butting your way in the door. Those people that do that are not in a good place. So the art of peace is not so much this thing that you're trying to create peace in the world, but you're trying to create peace inside yourself, because you are a microcosm of the universe.
Right.
So if you're at peace, the world is at peace.
Yeah.
Right. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are.
Right.
As Anais Nin said. Right. So that's this idea that if you look at this, what does O-Sensei mean by this? And you think, well, I shouldn't be so aggressive. Well, for one, people shouldn't really just judge the techniques. They should just do them, master them. And then after you master them, you go, oh yeah.
Right.
Here's where the inconsistency, here's where the problem is. I'm very aggressive, so I don't look at the Aikido techniques and think, oh, this is too aggressive. Right? So I go, this is not aggressive enough. Right?
I need to dial it up.
I love Atemi. So like the other day, Watanabe Sensei's teaching class, and I took his class, and then I don't look at my opponent anymore. And then Watanabe Sensei kind of made a point, like, you have to look straight ahead. You got to look him in the eye. Got to look straight ahead. He's like, or you get to a certain level and then you don't look at them all. And the reason why I don't look at them is because I developed this thing that one of the students called dead eye. And I did this to kind of like to intimidate my opponent, and to where when I look through them and then my face has no expression. But then people would tell me, like, I thought you were going to kill me today. And I was like, what? Yeah, when you and I trained together, I thought you were going to kill me. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Because that look on my face came across very aggressive.
Right.
Right. But that's the idea that, like, in the old days, you had Atemi. In the old days, you had body slamming. You had all these different things that they just don't do today because they're deemed too aggressive.
Right.
But it's not that they're too aggressive. They all have their place. It's just that if you're an aggressiveness junkie, guns inspire that aggressiveness. Atemi inspires those things. And then we cling on to these things because without them we would feel empty inside. I need to have a gun. Not that this is you guys. I need to have a gun or I feel weak inside. I need to beat people up or I feel weak inside. I need to dominate others or I feel weak inside. If Aikido is not effective, then I'm not effective.
Right.
I'm not tough. And then everybody's going to be, oh my gosh, I'm crying inside, right? But like that's the thing. It has nothing to do with the thing on the outside. It's only about the thing on the inside.
Yeah.
You know, and then so when we think about aggressiveness, and is a knife aggressive? It's just an inanimate object.
Yeah.
But you put it on the table, it's nothing. It's nothing more than a pen. But you put it on the table, no, we're all dying. It's just like, it's inanimate. But then when that person whips it out in class, you're like, oh. But you becoming afraid is a form of violence.
Yeah.
Violence towards yourself, I would imagine, or something like that. But then, how do you defend yourself if you don't have aggressiveness? There's no self to defend. So you don't need aggressiveness. But you think there's a self. You think there's a self. There is no self. We do not exist. Honrai mu ichimotsu. In the beginning there was nothing, now there is nothing, in the future there will be nothing.
Yeah. But
then we think there's something to defend. There is no self. Right? And then that's where I said, like, you want to be able to just move forward. And if you can move forward with nothing attached to it, that's what you're trying to get to.
Right. But that's a very high level. It's a very hard position to get to.
You have to get rid of all your BS.
Yeah.
Oh, am I effective? Oh, is this thing? I'm afraid of this guy. He's really tall. All these different things that you're going to come up with.
Yeah.
And then shed all those things and then just move forward. And then the sword cuts all on its own.
Yeah.
So the answer is you better just practice it.
So do you think that I know that like O-Sensei made a second doshu study classical swordsmanship as part of his training, and Furuya-sensei certainly encouraged many of his students to do Iaido. Do you think that at least in our context in our school that studying classical swordsmanship helps interpret irimi or that experience, or why do you think we still do it?
Well, we still do it because they say that swordsmanship is the fastest way to become good at Aikido, right? Because when you learn how to strike things, you learn the footwork, you learn the balance. Can you get good at Aikido without swordsmanship or without prior martial arts experience? I don't really know. It's really hard to say. I studied boxing a lot before I started doing Aikido. So I already knew how to kind of punch somebody.
Right.
If this person doesn't know how to use a sword, doesn't know how to punch people, how are you going to move in on them? And right? So you're trying to move in on them because there's supposed to be this idea of mutual death, aiuchi.
Right.
And then there's this idea of mutual missing, right, as Watanabe Sensei talks about. And then Aikido is about this mutual missing thing. And that when that person, you get that person to miss you, you move in and take control. So I'm not really sure what we can say is like, how do you reconcile this thing or that thing? Because should you use weapons? I really don't know. Should you do cutting in Bato Jutsu in Iaido? It's really hard to say. Furuya Sensei himself studied Kendo for like 20 years. He's a 3rd or 4th degree black belt in Kendo, 6th degree black belt in Iaido, expert with the sword, right? But his Aikido, see, like Watanabe Sensei, he has this thing where he throws and then he hits this ledge and then he moves his body forward and then it carries you forward. And it's such a trip to feel. It's like he cuts and then your body kind of falls onto this ledge, this like energetic ledge. He cuts, your body falls on this ledge, and then he moves forward and flings you forward, right? Like only 25 years in did I pick that up, and he's had that for decades. And the way I picked it up is that one day it was just me and Watanabe Sensei and one other student, and the other student was like super out of shape. So Ken and I just took turns training with this person. And then, of course, there was times when Watanabe Sensei and I worked together.
Right.
And then I got to feel it. And then I tried to recreate the technique on him. And he goes, whoa, man. That was the first time I had felt that way since Furuya Sensei died. And I was like, oh, cool. But it took me that long because he has this ability to project his throws way out there, right? And then like there's this weird ledge that he throws you out there and your body's like spinning in space, and then he just goes like boom, and then you fly forward. But see, like that's the thing. Can you learn that without swordsmanship? I don't know. Did Watanabe Sensei, he's had it since like, the 90s,
right?
When he cuts, and like in the old days when we did like Tenkan Kokiho or those types of things, we were supposed to fling the person, like, you turn the corner, slide and turn, step back, and then you slide forward and cut. You're supposed to upheave their body with your lower body as you move in irimi, and then whip their whole body forward so that they fly off into space and then fall down.
Wow.
But we don't do that anymore because it's too aggressive.
Right.
But you have to learn how to move a body in space. So should you be aggressive and do those things? I don't really know. I mean,
I have a question for you, and maybe this is one way that it gets resolved, but thinking about today's topic, I was wondering that isn't maybe the component, or maybe it's an element of the piece, is that when the throw or the nage is doing the technique, whatever it is, and it does an irimi style technique, that a lot of learning reconciliation or collaboration or harmony is on the uke. Like the uke is developing all these skills where they're able to feel the throw and develop very good ukemi, because we spend like a lot of time in our school trying to develop good ukemi skills. And I mean, I would say like at least half the time that I hear you making corrections in class, they're corrections in ukemi as much as you're making corrections in the technique.
I mean, that's true. I don't want people to get hurt, but you have to learn that taking ukemi is an art in itself. And on one level, when you're learning how to be a good uke, you're learning how to be aggressive because you have to learn how to strike and you have to learn how to grab properly.
Right.
And then you got to learn how to fall properly. And then Watanabe Sensei said something really interesting yesterday in class. He said that by taking the proper ukemi, you lessen the nage's decision-making ideas, right? So if you take ukemi in a certain way, they can only throw you in a certain way.
Interesting.
But if you take a crazy ukemi, then that opens up the options for them. So
snap, crackle, and pop.
So you take a certain ukemi to dictate the throw. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. That is true. Like if you fall this way, then the person has to do this.
Right.
Because it's always an if, then that. If the person does this, then you do that. If the person does this, you do that.
Right.
Largely when you do Aikido, it's choreographed. All martial arts is choreographed. And so that's a different thing. Is like, this idea of being contrived is that this person attacks a certain way and is going to take ukemi a certain way, and then you're going to throw them a certain way. So see how there's no real aggressiveness in there, because they're going to attack you in a certain way, they're going to fall in a certain way, and you're going to throw them a certain way.
Right.
So really that aggressiveness exists inside of you. And because the movements are contrived, they're contrived to teach you how to move when given this situation, but also how to move in a way in which you're calm.
So and the thought that popped into my mind as you were saying that was like free technique though. Like when you're doing a class where you maybe the last 5 minutes of class, you're like, okay, you can do any technique you want from this attack. Now in a sense that gets a little bit closer to a non-contrived arrangement, but it seems
it's still contrived.
No, I wasn't going to say it wasn't, but I was going to say that it's a little bit less, but the burden becomes a little bit more on the uke to be able to anticipate and blend in a more harmonious way, because they don't know what the technique is that's coming.
Well, they don't know the technique is coming because they're just along for the ride.
Right.
But a good uke will dictate the technique by how they take the ukemi. They drop here, that necessitates you do this. They stand up here, that necessitates you do that.
Right.
Not just you're grabbing onto the sleeve and you're along for the ride. That's why it's still contrived. Now, if I say do whatever you want to do, take whatever ukemi you want to take, then that's where it becomes less contrived, because then that person stands up if they want to, sits down, does all these things, then you have to compensate for that.
Right. You have to adjust.
Right. But then the Jewness, the freeness of it is really, again, within yourself, because your mind isn't contrived isn't in a contrived setting where I am going to do ikkyo.
Why do you think people, when they do jiwaza or free technique, often freeze?
Because they're thinking. You cannot do jiwaza while you're thinking. Your thinking mind is slower than your analytical mind is slower than your subconscious mind, right? So when your subconscious mind is moving, it can move a lot faster and do a lot more than your analytical thinking mind, conscious mind, where it can only think very slowly. So when they stop, their body is stopping so their mind can catch up. 1, 2, 3. And that's the thing. It's like if you say or Japanese researchers think that when we say or is to allow our minds to catch up to what we're saying.
Interesting. It's very interesting.
Right. So when in jiwaza, when the person stops,
they're trying to catch up.
They're trying to catch up. Their mind is trying to catch up. I will do ikkyo next. I will do sankyo next. And that's where you're trying to create that spontaneity.
Right.
Where it flows right through. And then you can only create that spontaneity when you've been doing this one attack so long that you just move into the next throw. But that's really hard to do. And if you ever watch a lot of aikidoists, when they do a demonstration, the demonstration is always the same. Same technique comes next. Same technique.
I mean, the person who's doing the demonstration always does the same demonstration because they just memorize it and then
they just do that one, as
opposed to like real free flow.
Yeah,
where the uke comes in, gives them an attack, and they're like, "Oh, I'll do the arm bar, or I'll do a throw."
Right.
Interesting.
But like that's where when I was a student, we used to have to do a lot of demonstrations, and every year I would choose a different attack.
Yeah.
And then I only worked on that one attack for the whole year. And the next year I changed to a different attack. Because and when I started out doing demonstrations, I just did Sawari Waza. Sawari Waza Ikkyo through Yonkyo, Iriminage Kotegaishi, that's it. But I did that because I didn't want to demonstrate, and I was nervous, and that was the easiest, most contained thing to do. But then I just became good at it, and then they always made me do it. And then at a certain point I started to change, and then I would just go to the demonstration cold, and I would say, what's the attack that's not being done? And they would say, this attack's not being done. I go, I'm going to do that one.
Interesting.
As a test, to test my ability level. But, getting back to this idea of aggressiveness, right? So aggressiveness is really about this idea of what's inside of you. Are you aggressive? Can you look at things and not be aggressive? Taking for yourself is a form of aggressiveness. The food gets presented, I just start eating. That's a form of aggressiveness because you're waiting for others. Yeah. Right? Pushing your way to the front, whether for whatever reason, assertive or aggressive, based on your interpretation, is still aggressive. Right? So it's not, but students shouldn't think of things in terms of aggressiveness, non-aggressive, passiveness, following the philosophies of O-Sensei, because they're not at that level. Yeah. We must follow the trajectory of O-Sensei's training, which is physical first, tai-iku, right? And then you move on to, mental training, spiritual training, and all that type of stuff. Yeah. But,
and I think that's hard though, when you get what we're seeing now in Aikido, we're certainly seeing it in our dojo, which is when you get a student who comes in their 30s or their 40s or even their 50s, who are very well trained in their job, they're analytical, and they're not necessarily ready to start at the very bottom of the physical ladder. So that, maybe they take some classes for a few weeks and they start generating intellectual questions about their training. And it's almost inevitable, it seems like, in our system of thought, that gets generated that way, that people always want to ask significant questions pretty early on in their training.
Yeah. But that's, again, that intellectualization of things. I read, all of O-Sensei's books, and then now O-Sensei's talking about peace and love and all these things, but I don't really like peace and love. Well, I guess I can't do Aikido. Right. No, like I used to joke all the time. Do you think that just because I study the art of peace that I can't start some stuff? Right? No, just like you could totally use there. Almost every technique in Aikido, there's a way you could kill somebody with it. Yeah. Or maim them in a way in which you can set them up to be killed. Yeah. But we don't talk about those things because those things are fleeting and empty. If I taught you just how to beat people up, you would never leave that.
Right.
It'd be too much fun going to biker bars and just throttling all these people, but you would never develop as a human being.
Right.
So O-Sensei puts it out there and dangles this carrot about the art of peace, and that's for you to study. What does he mean by peace, harmony, love? What does that even mean? And then it's right for Ayuri to ask this question, because then it helps her reconcile what aggressiveness means to her.
Right.
Maybe it's not so much aggressiveness as that perhaps, you could look at it from this idea of, I don't want to hurt this person. I'm not good enough to hurt this person. I'm afraid of retaliation if I hurt this person.
Right.
And all these different things. And so when you kind of go through each one of those things, you realize it's not that person at all. It's me.
Right.
And the aggressiveness is not what I do. It's what I conjure up in my mind as, if I'm aggressive with this person, they'll beat me up. If I'm aggressive with the person, I'll hurt them. If I'm aggressive, like all these things that come up, and you can just train.
Right. So, I mean, we've gotten pretty deep into this idea of that maybe this idea of aggression, the way it's thought of initially, is a little bit illusory. And I think you've broken it down really well, talking about how this concept of peace is very much centered in the individual's psyche. Is there anything that any one of us want to kind of say in terms of, again, I always like to come back to the practical. Is there anything other than train that we could impart to a Ayuri or any other student at another school who's listening to this and saying, aha, yeah, I feel the same way. I've got this conflict and I want to address it in my training.
For me, we have to believe that Aikido is a complete martial art, right? It can destroy people, it can save people, it can do all these different things. So this idea that what is real aggressiveness? If I have to push you off the cliff because you're about to shoot my kids, is that wrong? Is that right?
Right.
You have to think about what is true aggressiveness. And then, did I want to push you off the cliff? That's aggressive.
Right.
That's violence. But I did it because there was no other choice. The act was violent. The act was aggressive, but inside of me was not. I felt like there was no other choice. Right? So aggressiveness, this idea is open to interpretation, but irimi, as the question they asked, irimi is what balances out the passivity of the other techniques.
Right.
Right? Moving in. It is the barometer by which you're judged internally if it really is aggressive or not. If you can move forward and knock that person over with no malice in your heart, no raise in blood pressure, no raise in adrenaline levels, is that violence?
Right.
Does the sword cut all on its own?
Right.
So that's what I think about this idea of aggressiveness and non-aggressiveness.
Mike, did you have anything else you want to say?
Well, I deal with my own issues with aggressiveness as well. But for me, I there's two sides of the coin. There's times where, I get a little, fired up about things, and I can feel that aggressiveness coming out. But there are times where, something happens and you just kind of react with a non-judgmental thing, and then I go, oh, wow, that really worked. It's almost as if anger or aggressiveness is almost counterintuitive to the movement. And I think that's where it's important that we do the training to get past that threshold of
emotion.
Yeah. And maybe just the fact that we moved in without this thing in our heart where we realize, you know what, we can move and do these things and not need aggressiveness. It's the act of the movement and the timing and the blending. And it was like, oh, I didn't, wow, that guy just fell without that stuff in your heart.
Yeah. Because
the aggressiveness is almost like short circuits the technique.
Yeah.
Because you want it, I want this, rather just movement. It's like, oh, it just happened.
Yeah. I think both of you are saying very similar things. And, I hope Ayuri can take some of the things that we've said today and help that in her training, and other people get similar benefit from today's talk. I know I learned a lot today. And I want to thank both of you for helping me in my training.
Cool. So thanks for watching or listening to this podcast. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.